it is not going to be appropriate to use legitimate interest to rely on as a legal basis. Hello and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owolabi, and on my channel we talk about passing our privacy certification and tips and tricks for passing one privacy certification at a time. So today's review, we're going to be looking at the CIPPE exam for Domain 3. If you are brand new to privacy, the CIPPE acronym stands for the Certified Information Privacy Professional Exam for Europe. And we're going to be looking at Domain 3, and my insights for today are coming from the most recent body of knowledge applicable as of when this video is going up, which is June 2026. So a bit of background before we get into the domain. These bodies of knowledge change often, regularly. So it's really going to be important to look at the official website for the governing body, which is IAPP, before you decide to 1, purchase your resource materials, and 2, take a look at what's actually going to be tested. So today we're going to be looking at the Domain 3. Domain 3 looks at data processing in far more detail, and also transfers, transfer mechanisms, obligations under statute. Again, this test is pretty statute heavy. I've talked about the recurring themes that I personally have seen when I've taken each of these tests. And so if you're interested in a certification that is not so statute heavy, I would definitely recommend the CIPPE exam, because that's far more technical. If you're a privacy pro that operates more on the technical side, the CIPPE might be something that you could look into. But today we're going to be looking at a very statute heavy, legislation heavy certification. So if you are a legal professional or you're a privacy pro who operates in a attorney capacity, you are going to love this test. Let's look at data processing in Europe, and let's look at what constitutes a lawful basis. So when we think about data protection and what statute requires in order to process personal data for organizations, we're looking at an underlying mechanism that has to be relied upon based on the law. What is the basis that my company has to process this personal data? There is roles and responsibilities associated with an organization that processes personal data. And when we look at some of those foundational principles that we talked about in Domain 1 and Domain 2, you can go back to those videos and check those out. We know that we need to have a purpose for processing personal data. But in addition to having a purpose, we need to be looking at different legal bases. Legal bases are very important for statute, the GDPR, and also very important in processing European Union personal data. Now, you need to be very, very careful about what is applicable when processing personal data in the European Union, and that's covered in other domains. But applicability is really important because the GDPR is considered to be statute that is extraterritorial, meaning that it has influence outside of the geography where it is enacted. It operates outside of its territory. The territory that's generally covered is going to be the European Union and the European Economic Area. But if you are processing personal data and there's different factors that will make the GDPR apply to an organization, the scope could be outside of Europe. Now, it's going to be very important for you to understand that for the exam purposes and then as your work as a privacy professional. Let's get into legal bases again. So some of the legal bases that are discussed in Domain 3 are consent. Consent is incredibly important. There are certain factors that must be met in order for a legal basis of consent to be met. 1, it must be freely given. You cannot coerce an individual into providing their consent if that is the basis you want to rely on to conduct a particular processing activity. Now, I'm going to go through each factor and then I'm going to give you an example. 1, it needs to be freely given. You cannot coerce an individual and call it consent. 2, it has to be unambiguous. It has to be incredibly clear what it is that you're going to process. It needs to be just as easy to withdraw as it was to give. So if it only takes 1 click for an individual to provide consent, you have to make sure it's 1 click for them to take their consent away. So it needs to be freely given, unambiguous, just as easy to give as it was to withdraw. So it also needs to be specific, which is that you need to be able to be transparent about what it is that you're going to do with the personal data. And then it needs to be informed. Now, something you'll encounter, not just for the test, but as a privacy pro, is we have additional guidance from regulatory bodies in Europe about what consent generally needs to look like. because these factors could seem quite abstract without understanding or conceptualizing what consent truly looks like in practice. So definitely understand what consent looks like and regulatory guidance that has come out since the GDPR was enacted to understand clearly what consent looks like. Let's talk about some of the other legal bases. Contractual necessity. What does the statute constitute as contractual necessity? If you are processing personal data in furtherance of executing a contract, that would constitute contractual necessity, right? We've got a very interesting concept that does not exist in every single privacy legislation internationally, which is legitimate interest, right? There's certain factors that make legitimate interest a legal basis that can be relied on by organizations in order to conduct a specific processing activity. Now, it's not appropriate for every single personal data identifier, and you're going to need to be able to understand this, right? If we're processing special categories of personal data, it is not going to be appropriate to use legitimate interest to rely on as a legal basis. You need to be able to match different concepts to one another. You need to be able to list all of the different legal bases and then understand which identifiers are going to make which legal bases, which can an organization rely on, because it may be that you're going to encounter concepts that link together and be able to understand both just in one question. Another legal basis is vital interest. In some instances, it's going to be a requirement like a life or death. Another legal basis is legal obligation. If there is statute in a geography, and I'll give an example of this, if there's statute in a geography that requires a specific processing activity to be conducted, the legal basis that an organization can rely on is legal obligation. I'll give an example. OSHA. We've got different obligations under OSHA in the United States that must be done. If somebody has an accident at work, there's a specific report that needs to be completed by an organization. If we're going to understand what type of accident the person has encountered, who the person is, what organization they work for, we have different identifiers that we're collecting in furtherance of completing this report based on a different piece of statute, not a data protection piece of statute, a statute that is required on a federal level, right, in the United States. A legal basis that an organization could rely on in this instance is legal obligation. OSHA requires me to process personal data in order to meet my legal obligation under OSHA. So that's a really good example of that. So understanding the different types of legal bases is going to be instrumental for Domain 3. I want to talk a little bit about international transfers, because this is also very crucial. And I had talked at the beginning of this about the extraterritorial effect of the GDPR on organizations globally. The GDPR requires that organizations that transfer European Union personal data outside of the European Union to what is considered a third country to have and utilize a transfer mechanism. You need to be able to understand which transfer mechanisms may be applicable, right? We've got something called the Standard Contractual Clauses, which are boilerplate clauses that provide that safeguard and that transfer mechanism when data is transferred outside of the European Union to a third country. We've got adequacy decisions that organizations can rely upon. An adequacy decision effectively is a decision that's come out of the European Union that deems a specific geography adequate enough to receive European Union data, and that is a transfer mechanism, right? And some of these adequacy decisions have been provided in geographies like Japan, right? You need to be able to understand which countries already have an adequacy decision, which means that another different type of transfer mechanism, like a standard contractual clause, is not going to be required to transfer data out of the European Union to Japan and vice versa, right? So understanding the different types of transfer mechanisms is going to be valuable in Domain 3. So we've got legal bases, we've got these very key core concepts that are going to come up in different scenarios, whether it's processing personal data for email communications, whether it's processing biometric data, what legal basis can we rely on? Can we process personal data in Brazil? Can we transfer European Union data to Brazil? What can we rely on in that instance too? So understanding these core concepts that are discussed in statute, again, is going to be valuable for your review of Domain 3. So if you have any questions about what type of resources might be valuable in capturing your understanding of these concepts in different scenarios, you can leave a comment below. I do have available a question book that I created myself after taking this exam a number of years ago that you can purchase on Amazon to facilitate your studies as you're looking at taking this test. And I've also done a whole video about how I passed this a number of years ago on this channel. So if you are looking for another video to watch about how to pass privacy certifications, that would be one that I recommend for you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in another review.